Look, I'll be honest with you, when I first started playing the Spell Brigade, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just throwing spells together, hoping something would stick. And it worked for the first 2 rounds. After that, things went downhill fast. But after spending a good amount of time with version 1.0, I started picking up on a few things that actually made a difference. Nothing fancy, nothing that requires you to be an elite player, just some tips I wish someone had told me earlier. So if you're still trying to figure the game out, stick with me, because these 10 things might save you from some frustrating runs. If there's one thing the Spell Brigade makes clear early on, it's that ignoring the elemental infusion system is the fastest way to die without knowing why. The game gives you fire, lightning, ice, and acid right away, and it's very easy to just grab the first one that appears and move on without thinking. But once you understand how these elements interact, the gameplay moves to a completely different level. Lightning alone is a solid choice, and will probably be your go-to for general damage during most of your runs. However, if you manage to combine fire and lightning in the same spell, you create plasma, and that's when things really step up. The damage output this combination delivers is massive compared to any single element, and once you see the numbers climbing on the screen, it's hard to go back to anything else. Plasma is, without a doubt, one of the strongest combinations the game currently offers. But it's not just about stacking damage. There are situations where you're being swallowed by the Horde, and what you need isn't more damage, it's time. That's where ice comes in. Freezing entire groups of enemies creates that perfect window to reposition, breathe, and let your other spells do the work. And when an enemy has high health and nothing seems to be working, acid is the answer because it weakens them before killing, making fights that seemed impossible much more manageable. The lesson I learned is simple. There are no bad elements in the Spell Brigade, only elements used out of context. The developers built this system specifically so each combination solves a different problem, so the sooner you start thinking in terms of synergy instead of just brute force, the further your runs will go. Plasma for damage, lightning for consistency, ice for control, and acid for tanks. When you start a run, the natural temptation is to focus on everything that increases your damage or makes you more durable. More health, more armor, more resistance. It seems logical, right? But there's one attribute most people completely underestimate at the start, which in the late game is worth more than any HP points you can accumulate. I'm talking about movement speed. The problem starts appearing when you reach the final stages. Enemies aren't just stronger, they're faster, more aggressive, and arrive in numbers that make any defense-focused build look weak. Armor works well in the early stages, but when the screen is full of things coming at you from all sides, the game stops being about taking hits and starts being about never being in the wrong place. You can only achieve that if you have enough speed to control the space around you. Move speed completely transforms how you handle being cornered. Instead of relying on a huge HP pool to absorb damage while trying to get out of a bad situation, you simply don't get into that situation. You exit the circle before it closes, you reposition between groups, and you keep melee enemies always one step behind. It's active defense, not passive, and active defense, especially on higher difficulties, is much more efficient than any static number in your stats. So the next time you're choosing between an armor upgrade and a speed upgrade in the mid or late game, think twice, especially if you already have a decent HP base. Move speed on high difficulties isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The best roguelike players understood a long time ago that surviving isn't about being the toughest in the room, it's about being the hardest to hit. Surviving can be an absolute nightmare when the screen fills with enemies and you feel like there's nowhere left to run. We've already talked about how much movement speed helps, but what if I told you there's a way to simply ignore damage and walk through danger? Well, the dodge build has become the true meta for anyone wanting to dominate the hardest stages without breaking a sweat. The main goal here is to focus your upgrades until you hit the 50% dodge chance mark or higher. Think about it. Once you pass that percentage, statistically, more than half the attacks that should end your run will simply pass right through you. This alone relieves an absurd amount of pressure from your health bar and gives you that massive margin for error we all need when chaos takes over. But the real magic, what makes this build completely broken, happens when you find the dodge healing relic. When you combine this high dodge rate with healing triggered by dodges, The game flips upside down. You stop being the prey trying to survive. You know that giant horde that usually corners you? With this relic, you can literally walk through enemies because every attack you dodge ends up restoring your health, leaving you in a state of practical invincibility. And if you want to take this strategy to the absolute limit, try pairing this entire combo with the Solar Pulse spell. The synergy Solar Pulse has with this dodge and heal build creates a survival loop that is simply too good to ignore. Next time you play, test it out and focus on this combination of dodge with dodge healing. It's the kind of defensive strategy that completely changes your experience and makes you laugh in the face of danger in the late game. You know that moment when the horde surrounds you and it feels like you lack the damage to clear the screen? My first reaction was to look for explosive spells, but the true secret to melting enemies lies in a spell that many people discard because they think it's only for defense: the Scepter Mesh. If you've been setting this ability aside because you think it's too passive, you're missing out on one of the most absurd offensive tools the game has to offer. The trick here isn't to use the Scepter Mesh in the standard way, but to focus immediately on the right elemental combination. This spell has some of the highest damage potential in the Spell Brigade when you inject Pure Lightning into it, or better yet, when you reach that overpowered plasma infusion. What should be just a harmless wall transforms into a constant meat grinder, melting the health bar of any monster foolish enough to get close. And the coolest part is that while you're dealing all this massive damage, its original utility doesn't disappear. This ability creates essential area control on the battlefield, dictating the pace of combat. By infusing the barriers with this continuous fire or lightning damage, you set up a literal minefield that punishes creature advances and at the same time provides the perfect cover for you and your team to breathe and reposition without taking unnecessary damage. In the end, it's a matter of shifting your mindset on how to dominate the arena. The best defense is literally making sure enemies are obliterated by your own barrier before they can even touch your character. Next time you play, focus on giving the plasma upgrades to the Scepter Mesh and watch how the entire map becomes your personal domain. It's the kind of build that leaves your friends in co-op wondering what you're doing to clear the screen so fast. If there's one thing I've learned playing the Spell Brigade, it's that ignoring secondary objectives is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. People focus so much on surviving the horde and spamming spells that they completely forget about the missions running in the background. And I get it. The chaos on screen is real, but let me tell you why that's a huge error. The Spell Brigade has an augment system, which are basically modifications you apply to your spells to make them insanely powerful. And the key to unlocking the best of them, the legendaries, goes directly through completing those objectives you're ignoring. Every time you finish an objective within the run, you gain access to a new augment, and the more you focus on this, the higher the chances of rare and devastating options appearing. Think of it like this. You have a basic projectile spell. It seems average, does what it needs to do, but then you complete an objective and a legendary augment appears that makes that same spell explode on impact, fire additional projectiles, or even heal when it hits. Suddenly, that okay spell has become a machine of mass destruction. This is exactly what augments do to your build, and you only get to them when you take the time to complete the run's missions. Don't treat missions like a boring side chore. Treat them as the true path to turning your mage into an unsolvable problem for the enemies. The best builds I've ever seen in this game go through this. Look, there are upgrades in the game that look good on paper, but are mediocre in practice. And then there are upgrades that, when they appear, you stop everything and grab without thinking twice. Veil of Haste is exactly that. If it appears at rare rarity or higher during your run, there is no discussion, no debate. You take it. Simple as that. The reason is straightforward. Veil of Haste combines cooldown reduction with increased spell damage at the same time. It sounds basic, but in practice, this means you're casting spells faster. And each of those spells is hitting harder. When you start stacking these two attributes together in the same run, the rhythm of the game changes completely. What was once a normal combat flow becomes a constant avalanche of damage. Now, where Veil of Haste really shows what it can do is in Rune Burst builds or any high-frequency spell. This type of build already naturally depends on casting spells as fast as possible, so cutting the cooldown practically multiplies your total damage. With Veil at rare or above, you start seeing damage windows you normally would never see with other upgrades. It's the kind of thing that makes a run go from difficult to comfortable in a single choice. So if you're still skimming past this upgrade because it doesn't have a flashy name or an explosive visual effect, stop and reevaluate. Not every broken thing in the game comes with fireworks. Sometimes the strongest thing is precisely what looks simplest. And Veil of Haste is proof of that. Prioritize it whenever possible. You'll understand why as soon as your character literally stops at nothing to cast spells. If you haven't tried putting together a crit-focused build yet, I need you to do it now. Not tomorrow, not next run. Now. Because when you start stacking critical chance with critical damage and the right relics that amplify this system, the game literally stops being a challenge and becomes a special effects show, with absurd numbers popping up on the screen. The math here is brutal in a good way. It's possible to reach over 800%, even 1000% crit damage within a run. To give you an idea of what that means in practice, spells that already have high base damage, like Ether Beam, start erasing entire groups of enemies with a single critical hit. Every time the crit procs, you aren't just dealing damage, you are removing the enemy from existence. Combining a high base damage spell with this level of crit amplification is the most direct recipe for turning any run into total domination. But what makes the crit build even more insane is when you add the defensive layer on top of it. The best unkillable builds in the game revolve around 3 pillars: crit, dodge, and healing on crit. This means that every time you land a critical hit, in addition to the monstrous damage, you also heal yourself. With a high enough crit rate, you basically never stop regenerating during combat. Dodge comes in to cover the moments when you don't crit, and the result is a character that hits incredibly hard and takes almost no effective damage. The only thing I'd say for you to be careful with is not underestimating relics during the assembly of this build. They are what separate a good crit build from a game-breaking one. Whenever a relic with direct crit synergy appears, it has absolute priority in your choice. Set up the right system, and you'll reach a point in the run where you'll look at the screen and think, should this even be allowed? Spoiler, it is, and it's incredible. Most people assume that leveling up as fast as possible is always the right move, and it makes sense to think that way. More levels mean more upgrades, more power, more options. But the reality of the game's RNG system tells a different story, and once you understand this, the way you play changes completely. The problem starts to appear when you exceed certain levels in specific runs. Advanced players have already noticed that the pool of available upgrades starts to dilute significantly after level 15 in certain situations. In practice, this means you start seeing generic and weak options appearing much more frequently, exactly when you would most need powerful upgrades to sustain the run. RNG doesn't scale with your need, it just expands the range of possibilities, and not always in the direction you want. So in farming runs, or when you are hunting for specific achievements, controlling the pace of leveling up can be smarter than it seems at first. Staying around level 15 in certain situations keeps the pool more compact and increases the chances of truly good options appearing more consistently. It's a counterintuitive approach, but it's the kind of knowledge you only acquire after many hours in the game paying attention to patterns. Obviously, this isn't an absolute rule for every single run. In normal progression runs, you'll want to level up without thinking about it. But when the goal is maximum efficiency, whether for resource farming or completing a specific achievement that requires consistency, it's worth testing this approach. Sometimes playing in a more calculated and deliberate way yields much better results than simply killing everything and accumulating XP on autopilot. There's a constant tension that every experienced player has felt. You see a team objective appearing on the screen, you know it could yield something good, but the situation around you is completely out of control. And then comes the question that can define your entire run. Is it worth the risk? The honest answer is, it depends, and knowing how to distinguish these moments is one of the most important skills you can develop in the game. The most specific achievements in the game, like lighting braziers in the right order with the team, require real coordination and focus on team objectives. When you're in a smooth run with the build working well, pursuing these objectives is always the right play, because besides the achievement, you also secure rewards that strengthen the run. The problem is, when you are in a pure survival run, on the edge of health, with the build still forming, and a dangerous objective appears in the way. In this scenario, forcing it to complete the mission can cost exactly what you were trying to protect. And speaking of protecting the run, escape portals are something many people literally ignore in the heat of combat. In hardcore mode especially, these portals are the difference between losing everything and managing to leave with the run intact. When a portal appears in a critical situation, leaving isn't weakness, it's strategy. The game doesn't reward unnecessary heroism in hardcore, it rewards smart decisions. The mentality that works here is simple. Team objectives are a tool, not an obligation. When conditions are favorable, dive headfirst into them because the rewards are worth a lot. When the run is on the razor's edge, back off, use the portal if you need to, and don't look back. The best hardcore players aren't the bravest. They're the ones who know exactly when each choice is worth the cost. If you reached the final boss and took that beating that makes you question all your life choices, relax, because it's probably not you, it's your build. There is a very common mistake players make when reaching the game's toughest bosses, continuing to insist on a single target damage build when the encounter wasn't made for that. And the final boss of the Spell Brigade is exactly the type of content that punishes this approach without mercy. The turning point here is understanding that area damage, AoE, with high spell size and reduced cooldown, covers much more than most people imagine in a boss encounter. It sounds counterintuitive. After all, it's a single boss. Why would you need AoE? But in practice, the boss generates adds, has phases of intense movement, and moments where you can't stay still aiming at just one spot. A well-built AoE build covers all this space much more comfortably than any well-optimized single target. Spell size is the detail most people forget to prioritize in this equation. Increasing the size of your spells means that even when the boss is moving fast or you are dodging mechanics, your spells are still connecting. Combine this with reduced cooldown, and you create a continuous damage flow that doesn't depend on hitting specific windows with surgical precision. It's a more robust approach and much more tolerant of errors during an intense fight. So if you're stuck on the final boss, before trying once more with the same build, stop and evaluate what you're using. Shift the focus from single target to AoE, prioritize spell size in your next upgrades, and look for relics that reduce cooldown. You don't need to rebuild everything from scratch. Often it's just one or two swaps that make the whole run click. The boss didn't get easier, you just started fighting him the right way.